I sat alone in my apartment, listening to the soft patter of rain against the window. The world outside was muted, the gray sky hanging heavy with clouds, as if echoing my own mood. My husband had left for a business trip earlier that day, and this rare solitude should have been a welcome relief. For once, there was no noise, no demands, no rush, just silence. And yet, the silence seemed almost oppressive, as if it was pressing in from all sides. I tried to distract myself, to embrace the quiet, but something was off. It wasn't just the absence of my husband, it was the air, thick and still, like the calm before a storm. My thoughts began to spiral, despite my efforts to remain calm. The apartment, familiar and comfortable, felt too large now, too empty. The ticking of the clock on the wall was too loud, too deliberate. I walked from room to room, but nothing eased the unease gnawing at me from within. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something more subtle, something deeper. The sound of rain, once soothing, now seemed to mock me. The world outside was so distant, so removed from my own internal disarray. I tried to distract myself by opening a book, but the words blurred in front of my eyes. I couldn't concentrate. I set it aside, running my hands through my hair, my mind racing with an unspoken question. Why did it feel like something was waiting to happen? The house seemed to breathe with me, its creaks and groans underscoring the rising tension in my chest. Every movement felt like it was amplifying that feeling, the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was. And then, it came. A faint noise, like a door creaking open. I froze. My pulse quickened. It was coming from the hallway, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but it was there. Distinct, deliberate. I couldn't ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, the old wooden floors shifting as they always did. But no, this felt different. It wasn't the familiar groan of the house I had lived in for years. It was something else, something that pulled at the edges of my sanity. I stood there in the middle of the living room, trying to decide whether I should investigate or just let it go. But the decision didn't come. Instead, I was caught in that moment, suspended, waiting for the next sound to confirm or deny what I was already beginning to fear. The tension in the air thickened, and in that heavy silence, I heard it again. The sound echoed through the hallway again. This time, it was clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the creak of an old house settling or the wind brushing against the windows. It was a deliberate noise, like footsteps, slow and measured. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, not sure what to do next. The apartment had always been quiet at night, and I had always taken comfort in that. But tonight, the quiet felt foreign, unsettling. I strained my ears, waiting, almost hoping that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the footsteps continued, soft but persistent. I stepped cautiously toward the door that led into the hallway. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. The hallway light was off, casting the space in a dim, almost impenetrable darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and slowly opened the door just a crack. I peered into the hallway, but there was no one there. The shadows stretched long across the floor, creating strange shapes that seemed to dance and shift as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I stepped into the hallway, heart racing, my every sense alert, but everything seemed still, too still. The strange footsteps had stopped. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, taking a brief, collective breath before holding its ground again. I waited, tense, scanning every corner. But there was nothing. Only the lingering sensation that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite place. I forced myself to move, to ignore the tight knot of fear that had settled in my stomach, but as I walked down the hallway toward the living room, I heard it again. This time louder, a scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I whirled around, my heart thudding painfully in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway was empty, no sign of anything unusual, no shadowy figures lurking in the dark. And yet that scraping sound continued, as if it were coming from just behind me, lingering in the very walls of the house. I turned back toward the living room, eyes wide and searching. The apartment was still, too still. I tried to reason with myself. The house was old, after all. It had its quirks, its noises, its way of shifting and creaking at night. But this felt different. This wasn't normal. I pressed my palm against the wall, trying to steady myself, but my mind was racing. What could it be? What was causing it? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone? Suddenly, the front door clicked open. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. My husband was away, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. I stepped toward the door slowly, cautiously. Was it the wind? A neighbor, maybe, coming in for a quick visit? But no. As I reached the door, I saw a shadow at the edge of my vision. It moved, almost imperceptibly at first, and then there was a figure standing there, framed by the dim light spilling from the hallway. It was Max. Max, my husband's son, who I hadn't seen in years. He stood in the doorway, a little awkward, a little uncertain, but there he was, as if he had simply walked in from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. Max stood in the doorway, looking as surprised to see me as I was to see him. His hair was tousled, his expression uncertain. For a moment, we just stared at each other, caught in that strange moment of reconnection. "I didn't expect you to still be up," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I blinked, trying to steady my racing thoughts. What was he doing here? My mind had been spinning with odd noises, but here he was, standing in front of me, looking a bit lost, as if he hadn't quite meant to interrupt. He shifted uncomfortably on the spot. I was just in the neighborhood," he added. "I didn't think you'd mind if I stopped by." I shook my head, still trying to make sense of the situation. "Of course, it's fine," I said, though my voice lacked the usual warmth. We exchanged a few more words, but the tension was palpable. Something in the air had shifted, and I couldn't quite place it. It felt awkward, like we were both trying to find our footing in a space we weren't used to. We stood too close, the space between us charged with a tension I couldn't explain. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, yet something in the air felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, Max's lips brushed mine. It was brief, almost accidental, but the intensity of the moment made it feel like time had stopped. His touch was light, almost apologetic, and yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me. We both froze, the suddenness of it catching us off guard. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, my mind scrambling to process what had just happened. Max stepped back almost immediately, his eyes wide, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered quickly, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't find the words. My body felt like it was on fire, but my mind was blank, trapped in a swirling storm of emotions. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, and neither of us knew how to break it. In that moment, it was clear. Something had shifted, but what it meant, neither of us could say. After the kiss, things between us became impossible to ignore. The air seemed thicker, heavier, every glance loaded with unspoken words. I found myself avoiding Max whenever I could, retreating into the quiet rhythm of everyday tasks, hoping the distance would help me forget the rawness of the moment we had shared. But no matter how much I busied myself, the tension between us only seemed to grow. It was in every brief encounter, when I reached for a dish he had just touched, when our eyes accidentally met across the room. It was there, hanging like a shadow, something neither of us could talk about, but both of us could feel. I could see it in his eyes, too. He didn't bring it up, and neither did I, but it was as if we were both waiting for something, some clarity, some understanding that might make sense of everything. I tried to push it away, to lock it in the deepest corners of my mind, but the weight of that moment lingered. I couldn't escape it. Neither could he. The silence between us had become unbearable, thick and suffocating, each second stretched taut with uncertainty. And so we said nothing. But in the silence, everything changed. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, only to find Max standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His expression was different this time. Gentler, softer, like he was trying to reach out but unsure how to bridge the gap between us. "How are you?" he asked, his voice quiet, sincere. There was no hidden agenda, no awkwardness, just a simple question. I paused, momentarily caught off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had asked me that. My husband was away, and the world had felt so distant, so impersonal. Max's concern felt strangely comforting, like a lifeline in the midst of all the uncertainty. "I'm okay," I said, my voice betraying the crack in my facade. I set the knife down, feeling the weight of his gaze, the weight of everything unsaid between us. He didn't press, but I could see it in his eyes, the genuine concern, the quiet patience. It made me want to explain everything, to confess the turmoil that had been growing inside me, but I couldn't find the words. The complexity of the situation, the way it had escalated so quickly, felt too much to untangle in a single conversation. Instead, I simply nodded, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine, just tired." Max didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He lingered for a moment, his presence almost soothing despite the tension, before he gave a small nod. "I'm here if you need anything," he said, his voice steady. I watched him leave the kitchen, the door clicking softly behind him. I stood there for a long time after, the knife still in my hand, the room feeling unnervingly empty without him in it. There was something in the way he had looked at me, something that spoke to a deeper understanding, a shared vulnerability. It was a moment of honesty, and for the first time in a while, I wondered if it was enough to change everything. The next morning, I found myself sitting on the veranda, watching the sky shift from dark to light as the first rays of the sun broke through the horizon. The cool morning air felt refreshing, almost calming, but the stillness of the moment didn't ease the restlessness inside me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Max appeared quietly, stepping onto the porch and settling into the chair beside me without a word. We sat there for a while, side by side, watching the sky change as the day began. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It felt natural, as though we had both found a space where words weren't necessary. Finally, Max broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about what you would have done differently in life?" he asked, his voice thoughtful, almost contemplative. I looked at him, surprised by the depth of the question. It wasn't something I had expected to hear from him, especially not now, not after everything that had happened between us. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me want to answer honestly, even if it scared me. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think about it sometimes, but it's hard to say. Life doesn't really give you that chance, does it? Things just happen. You make choices and then you live with them." Max nodded, his gaze still focused on the horizon. "Yeah, I guess that's true." He paused, his lips pressed together as if he was considering something. "But maybe we don't always realize how much we can change, you know? Even small decisions, small moments. They can add up. They can lead you to something different." I let his words settle in the silence that followed. It was a quiet truth, a simple realization that I hadn't given much thought to before. Perhaps the course of my life had been shaped by things I hadn't even noticed at the time, decisions made in passing, moments I hadn't understood the weight of until now. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change, like the conversation had opened a door to something deeper between us. It was in the way we looked at each other, in the quiet understanding that passed between us. We both knew there was more to say, but for once, neither of us felt the need to rush it. For that brief moment, I allowed myself to think that perhaps, just perhaps, everything that had happened between us wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was part of some strange, tangled path that we were both walking, whether we wanted to or not. The days that followed felt different, as if the very fabric of my reality had subtly shifted. The moments I shared with Max, the quiet conversations, the unspoken understanding, everything seemed to have left an imprint on me. I couldn't ignore it, and neither could he. It was as if we were both standing at the edge of something we didn't fully understand, but neither of us knew how to step back. When my husband returned home, the weight of the situation hit me harder than I had anticipated. He was tired from his trip, eager to settle back into his routine, but I couldn't just slip back into the life I had before. Not now. Not after everything that had happened between Max and me. I found myself avoiding my husband in small ways too, taking longer than necessary to do things, hiding in my work, keeping myself occupied with the most trivial tasks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living a double life, that my mind and heart were divided between two worlds, neither of which I could fully inhabit. Max and I didn't talk about what had happened. It hung between us, unacknowledged. But it was there, in the space between every glance, every touch, every passing moment. We couldn't go back to the way things had been before. I knew that, and I think he did too. One evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring out at the darkness outside, wondering how it had all come to this. Max was sitting across from me, his eyes fixed on the floor. The silence was suffocating, yet neither of us could bring ourselves to break it. Finally, Max spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We can't go back, can we?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The truth of his words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. It wasn't just about what had happened between us. It was about everything. The unspoken connection, the emotional shift, the way our lives had become tangled in ways we couldn't undo. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking the stillness. "Everything feels wrong, and yet it feels like it's the only thing that makes sense." Max looked up at me then, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. "Maybe we just need to face it," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, we can't keep pretending like nothing changed." I felt the weight of his words settle deep inside me. There was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled in complexity and emotion, but I couldn't keep running from it. I couldn't keep pretending. As the night stretched on, I knew that this was a crossroads, a moment that would define everything that came next. Max and I were no longer the people we had been. We had crossed a line, and now we were standing together at the edge of an uncertain future. And I didn't know where it would lead, but I also knew, deep down, that the decision had already been made. Days passed, and the silence between Max and me became even more pronounced. We both understood that there was no going back, but we were also trapped in that painful, confusing in-between. The world outside seemed to keep moving, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside our small apartment. My husband went about his routine, never suspecting that his return had changed everything. Max and I didn't speak of the moment we had shared, of the kiss, of the unspoken understanding that had passed between us, but everything felt different. Even the smallest interactions, the simplest exchanges, carried the weight of everything unaddressed. It was on a rainy afternoon that I found myself standing at the window, watching the droplets race down the glass, my mind a blur of questions and emotions. Max appeared behind me, his presence almost like a shadow, quiet and unavoidable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. It was the same question he had asked me before, and yet this time it carried more weight, more urgency. I turned to face him, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable. "I don't know anymore," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what any of this means." Max took a step closer, his expression softening. "Maybe we're not supposed to have all the answers," he said quietly. "Maybe we just have to face it together, whatever happens." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. There was no clear path forward, no roadmap to guide us through the mess we had created. But somehow, in that moment, I realized something. The future was ours to shape, even if we didn't know how. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I touched his arm. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it felt like a promise to face whatever came next, together. We didn't know what the future held, but for the first time we were no longer afraid to walk into it.